Welcome back, everyone. We're kicking off the new year with a deep dive into the fascinating world of the white-crowned pigeon.
Ooh, a pigeon deep dive. I'm intrigued.
I know, right? It might not sound super exciting at first, but trust me, there's more to this bird than meets the eye.
Okay, you've got my attention. What's so special about this pigeon?
Well, for starters, it's a symbol of the delicate balance in our tropical ecosystems. And believe it or not, it can actually tell us a lot about the health of those environments.
That's interesting. I'm always up for learning about how animals can reflect the health of their surroundings.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So to kick things off, can you tell us a bit about what makes the white-crowned pigeon so unique?
Well, their appearance is definitely striking. They have this sleek, slate-gray body, but then boom, a brilliant white crown that really stands out.
So they're like the royalty of the pigeon world.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And that crown actually plays a big role in their lives, both good and bad. It makes them a favorite among bird watchers, but unfortunately it also makes them stand out to hunters.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought about that. It's like a double-edged sword. So before we dive into the threats they face, can you paint a picture of where these pigeons call home? What kind of habitat do they prefer?
Picture this. Lush mangrove forests growing right out of the water, tropical hardwood forests full of ancient trees, and the sun-drenched islands of the Caribbean and Florida Keys. That's why you'll find these pigeons. They really love those remote, undisturbed areas.
It sounds idyllic,
Mm.
but wouldn't that also make them super sensitive to any changes in their environment?
Exactly. Their habitat preference really highlights their dependence on a healthy, balanced ecosystem. In fact, scientists consider them an indicator species. Their presence or absence can tell us a lot about how an area is doing.
Like a canary in a coal mine.
Exactly. And one of the key ways they contribute to that balance is through their diet.
Okay, so what does a white-crowned pigeon eat? I'm picturing them pecking at the ground for seeds, kind of like those pigeons we see in cities.
Nope, not quite. They're actually frugivores, meaning they feast on a variety of delicious fruits. Think poisonwood, sea grape, and pigeon plum. Their diet reads like a tropical smoothie menu.
Wow, so they're more like gourmet diners than your average city pigeon.
You could say that. And here's where it gets even more interesting. They play a crucial role in seed dispersal. As they move from tree to tree, enjoying their fruit buffet, they're spreading the seeds of those native plants, helping them thrive and maintaining the biodiversity of the whole ecosystem.
So they're like little flying gardeners, helping to keep those forests healthy and diverse.
Precisely. It's a beautiful example of how interconnected nature really is. But sadly, as we touched upon earlier, they face some serious threats to their survival.
Right, you mentioned hunting. Can you tell us a little more about that? Where is this happening and what's being done to address it?
Sadly, hunting is still a problem, particularly in some parts of the Caribbean. People hunt them for food.
I see, so it's more of a subsistence hunting issue than sport hunting.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And it's tricky because while there are regulations in place, like the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in the U.S., enforcement can be challenging.
The Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Can you explain what that is for those of us who might not be familiar with it? What does it do exactly?
Sure thing. It's an agreement between the U.S. and several other countries, and it protects migratory birds, including our white-crowned pigeon friend, from being hunted or captured without permits. It's been a crucial tool for conservation.
That's good to hear. But I imagine that habitat loss is another huge issue. Can you tell us more about how that's impacting these pigeons? What's happening to their homes?
Habitat loss is probably the biggest threat they face. It's like their homes are shrinking all around them. Deforestation, urban development, and agriculture are all taking away their space. And there's actually a study you shared with me that was pretty eye-opening.
Oh, you mean the one about the Florida Keys?
There.
Yeah, it's pretty alarming.
That's the one. It highlighted that in the Florida Keys alone, they've lost over 30% of their mangrove habitat in the last 50 years. That's a big chunk of their home gone.
30% in just 50 years, that's a staggering number. And I imagine that loss forces them to compete more for the resources that are left.
Absolutely. It puts a ton of pressure on an already vulnerable population.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, there's the ever-growing threat of climate change.
Right, we talked about their love for those coastal areas.
Yeah.
How is climate change affecting those habitats? What are the specific impacts they're facing?
Well, rising sea levels are a huge concern. As the oceans rise, they're literally drowning out those low-lying coastal areas, including the mangrove forests that these pigeons need for nesting and foraging.
So it's like their homes are slowly disappearing beneath the waves.
That's a powerful way to put it. And then you've got stronger and more frequent hurricanes, which can just devastate their nesting sites and food sources.
It's like they're being hit from all sides. But you mentioned earlier that they're considered an indicator species. What exactly does that mean, and how does that tie into conservation efforts?
Right. So an indicator species is basically like a living barometer for an ecosystem. In the case of the white-crowned pigeon, their presence or decline can tell us a lot about how those tropical forests and coastal areas are doing.
So by studying these pigeons, scientists can get a better understanding of the overall health of those environments.
Exactly. For instance, if scientists see a drop in the white-crowned pigeon population in a certain area, it could be a sign that something's off. Maybe there's been habitat loss or a decrease in food, or maybe some other environmental stressor is at play.
So it's like a warning signal that we need to investigate further.
Precisely. That's why it's crucial to understand the white-crowned pigeon and the threats they face. It gives us a bigger picture of what's going on in these vital ecosystems. Protecting this pigeon isn't just about saving one species, it's about preserving the balance of nature that we all depend on.
That makes a lot of sense. So knowing all this, what are some things being done to help protect these pigeons and their habitats? Are there any bright spots in all of this?
Thankfully, yes, there are a lot of people working hard to make a difference. One of the key approaches is habitat restoration, giving these pigeons a fighting chance.
Oh, okay, so what does that look like in practice? What specific actions are people taking to restore those habitats?
Well, for one, there are some fantastic projects happening to replant mangroves, preserve hardwood forests, and even create protected areas where these pigeons can thrive. It's all about giving them back the space they need to survive.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
But I can only imagine those efforts take a ton of collaboration and resources.
You're absolutely right. It takes a village, as they say. And that's where the amazing work of governments, nonprofits, researchers, and local communities comes in. But we'll have to dive into those fascinating collaborations after a quick.
Hold on. You can't leave us hanging like that. Tell us more about those collaborations.
All right, all right. I can tell you're eager to learn more. Let's delve into how these different groups are coming together to make a real difference for the white-crowned pigeon.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. This is exactly the kind of deep dive I was hoping for.
So you're curious about these collaborations, huh? It's really cool to see how white-crowned pigeon conservation brings together all sorts of different groups: governments, nonprofits, researchers, and local communities.
That makes total sense to me. It seems like you'd need all hands on deck for any conservation effort to really be effective. Can you give us an example of what this collaboration looks like on the ground?
Absolutely. Let's take a trip to the Florida Keys. The Key West National Wildlife Refuge is a super important nesting area for these pigeons, but it faces a lot of threats, from habitat loss to invasive species.
Okay, I'm picturing a nature documentary right now. All those cute baby pigeons nestled in the mangroves, but with all those threats looming in the background. So what are people doing to help?
There's this awesome partnership in place between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, local conservation groups, and even volunteers from the community.
Wow, so it's a real team effort.
Big time. They're working on restoring those native plants, removing those pesky invasive species, and even monitoring nesting sites to protect the birds during breeding season.
That's fantastic. It sounds like a massive undertaking, though. I imagine coordinating all those different groups and efforts probably comes with its own set of challenges, right?
Oh, for sure. One of the toughest parts is making sure everyone is on the same page. Imagine trying to herd cats, but the cats are government agencies, passionate scientists, and enthusiastic volunteers. It's a lot of different priorities, funding sources, and approaches to juggle.
I can only imagine. So how do they overcome those hurdles and work together effectively?
Communication is absolutely key. Regular meetings, sharing data, and developing strategies that benefit everyone involved. And building trust between the different groups is super important too. It takes time and effort, but those successful partnerships really demonstrate that it's worth it.
It's so inspiring to see people setting aside their differences to work toward a shared goal like that. But shifting gears a bit, what about the challenges that are unique to the white-crowned pigeon? What makes them particularly tricky to conserve?
Their migratory nature definitely adds another layer of complexity. They're not just staying put, they're moving between islands and different habitats all year round. This makes it a lot harder to track and protect them.
So you're not just protecting one area. You have to think about that entire migratory route.
You got it. And that requires international cooperation, which, as you can imagine, can be very, very complicated. Different countries, different laws, different resources. It takes a ton of diplomacy and collaboration to make sure those pigeons are safe along their whole journey.
Wow, I hadn't even considered that. It really emphasizes how connected everything is, not just within ecosystems, but across borders as well.
Absolutely. It's a prime example of how conservation requires that global perspective. And speaking of the big picture, we can't forget about climate change.
Right, we talked earlier about those rising sea levels and intense hurricanes.
Huh.
But is there anything being done from a conservation standpoint to address those climate change impacts directly?
It's a massive challenge, but conservationists are trying to tackle it from all sides. For one, they're trying to figure out which areas are the most vulnerable to climate change so they can prioritize protection there. And they're working to make those habitats more resilient, almost like giving them a shield against those climate impacts.
So prepping them for the challenges ahead, can you give me an example of what that would look like in practice?
Take mangrove forests, for example. They're planting a wider variety of mangrove species to boost genetic diversity, which will hopefully help them adapt to those changes in sea level and salinity.
That's so cool. It's like they're building a natural buffer to help those forests weather the storm, both literally and figuratively. But these large-scale restoration projects, I can only imagine they need a lot of support, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. That's why backing from governments, nonprofits, and even everyday people is crucial. And this is where public awareness really matters. The more people understand how urgent this is, especially its impact on species like the white-crowned pigeon, the more likely they are to get behind those crucial conservation efforts.
So it's kind of a chain reaction. More awareness leads to more support, which leads to those on-the-ground actions that make a real difference. But what about studying the white-crowned pigeon itself? What are some of the challenges researchers face when trying to monitor these birds in the wild?
Well, for starters, these pigeons can be quite sneaky. They blend in really well with their surroundings, and they like to hang out in those dense, remote areas.
Even finding them must be an adventure.
It definitely keeps things interesting. Researchers have to be really creative. Sometimes they use these special nets called mist nets to capture the birds safely so they can band them and study them. Other times, they'll use the pigeons' calls to track them down in the forest.
I can picture it now. A researcher out in the jungle with binoculars and a sound recorder, deciphering pigeon conversations. It honestly sounds like a pretty cool job.
It definitely has its perks, and it's super rewarding. By learning more about the white-crowned pigeon's behavior, movements, and breeding patterns, researchers can create much more effective conservation strategies.
So it's like detective work, piecing together clues to figure out how to give those pigeons the best chance of survival.
That's a great way to put it. And sometimes those discoveries lead to unexpected findings that can benefit not just the pigeons, but the entire ecosystem.
Oh, I love a good plot twist. Can you share an example of one of those surprising discoveries?
One area of research that's really exciting is understanding the pigeon's role as a seed disperser. Scientists are really digging into which fruits they prefer, how far they spread those seeds, and what conditions those seeds need to actually sprout and grow.
So they're not just snacking on fruit. They're planting the seeds for future generations of trees.
Exactly. And by understanding that process better, researchers can help restore those degraded forests and create corridors to connect fragmented habitats. It's like building wildlife highways.
That's incredible. It's a win-win for the pigeons and the whole ecosystem. It's amazing how much we can learn from these birds. It just goes to show that even seemingly small creatures can play such a huge role in the bigger scheme of things.
Couldn't agree more. And that brings us back to that big picture. Conserving the white-crowned pigeon isn't just about saving one species. It's about understanding how connected we all are and working to protect the balance of nature that we all rely on.
That's a powerful message. But before we wrap things up, I'm really curious to hear about some of those conservation success stories you mentioned earlier. Have there been any efforts that have made a real difference for the white-crowned pigeon?
Oh, absolutely. There are definitely reasons to celebrate. But before we get to those inspiring stories, let's take a moment to appreciate everything we've learned so far. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the pigeon's unique features and challenges to the amazing efforts underway to protect them.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride. It's crazy to think how much we've learned about this one bird and its impact on the world around it.
Yeah.
But now I'm ready for some good news. Give me those success stories.
All right, get ready to be inspired because we're about to dive into some truly heartwarming examples of how dedicated people and collaborative efforts are making a positive impact for the white-crowned pigeon.
Okay, I'm all ears.